Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Energy News Beat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. We got us a real treat today. I've got Dr. Robert Brooks, and he is the founder and chairman of RBAC. And you've been in there about 33 years. Welcome, Dr. Brooks.
Well, thank you very much, Stu. It's nice to be on your program.
Oh, I'll tell you what, I really have enjoyed getting to know you guys through your son and Cyrus. But you have been kind of in the business for a little while. We both have gray hair. You have hair for our podcast listeners. I don't. But tell us where you started from. And I want to ask you one thing. What did you do your doctorate in?
Okay, so I'll do that first, and then I'll go back to the beginning.
You bet.
My doctorate is in a field, was at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And
Nice.
the major was operations research, which has nothing to do with cutting people up, by the way, or anything like that. It more has to do with actually, you might say, applied mathematics. It originally came out of World War II, actually, when the Army needed to figure out how to optimally move cargoes and weapons and people and whatever else around the world. And so they got some mathematicians together and they figured out, well, this is how you apply mathematics to that problem. And so this was the operations part, you see. So they were doing operations research and eventually became optimization and various other kinds of things. So as far as the beginnings of what I'm doing now, which has to do with development of and making available of analytics capabilities to the generalized energy industry. And what I mean by generalized is not just participants in the energy industry, but also consultants that work in the industry and also government agencies that are related to energy. So, basically anything that has to do with the energy industry. It's a long time ago. You're right about that, Stu. And actually, even before, I was a student there in the Sloan School at MIT, learning about energy economics, which was like the minor I had. And so operations research with energy economics. But before that, I was actually sort of peripherally interested, you might say, in energy, back in the 60s. And the 60s was a very interesting time period for those of us like you were talking about who actually got a chance to experience that. So I grew up in a little town in Northern California called Sunnyvale. And this was in what was called the Santa Clara Valley, but it got superseded by Silicon Valley. So it's part of what we call Silicon Valley now. But there was one of the industries that moved into Sunnyvale, which prior to this was a dairy town. Basically, it had dairies and farms and that sort of thing. But Lockheed built a huge plant there with, and employing 20,000 people. Pretty close to the Naval Air Station, often called Moffett Field, that my father was assigned to because my father was in the Navy. So that's how we got to Sunnyvale. So there was always this, this thing about space, and I was very interested. Actually, I wanted to be an astronaut, and I wanted to be a space scientist, and so forth. And so my personal education, you might say, my self-education had to do largely with that field. For various reasons, as I went to college, I kind of got, what should I say, I fell out of love with that because of the, basically the Vietnam War. I started seeing, hey, this stuff is used in a very destructive kind of way, and I didn't want to participate in that. But I did get interested in something that I read about in a paper. There was something called the satellite solar power system, that an idea that Peter Glaser came up with from a company called Arthur D. Little that was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I was actually in Austin, Texas at this time, and was actually doing a master's degree in physics at this time, which was also another interest of mine. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. This idea that you could put these giant satellites in space and they could collect solar energy all the time because they were not really in the dark spot, in the dark. And then they could beam this energy down to the planet as microwaves.
Right.
So I thought, wow, this is like space, but it's energy and it's solar energy and it's clean and it's not oil and gas and all this nasty stuff.
Right.
So this would be very interesting. And also, there was another thing that was very interesting that kind of tied in with this, which was there was a guy around, you probably remember, not very well known these days, but very well known at that time, named Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller was a philosopher, self-taught philosopher scientist, who invented the geodesic dome, which, there's a lot of them around. But he had this idea that the way that you solve the problem of intermittency with solar energy was you built a DC, high voltage DC line around the North Pole. Okay, and then you tie that into, with stringers that might go down to Canada, into Russia, into Europe and China and all around like this. And so as the Earth rotates, somebody's always getting solar power.
Right.
And therefore, again, you can solve this problem that, day and night problem. You can have solar energy everywhere. In any case, these were all very huge projects too, and I didn't really understand at that point. I was not sophisticated enough in my knowledge to understand what kind of costs would be involved in doing these things and how abstract that they really were, even though they were kind of cool ideas. So when I went to graduate school at MIT, I needed a job, and I actually just sort of fell into this research project that was funded by the National Science Foundation to study the natural gas market, which I knew nothing about at all. And so that's basically how I sort of started getting involved with natural gas, learning how to understand the data that was associated with it and how to use that data to do statistical analysis and then also to do forecasting. And so, I was on that project for 3 years, and basically that is sort of the foundation from which I eventually built this company, RBAC, and built the various products that we have, based on that original experience there as a graduate student at MIT. So yeah, that's kind of that was a long version, but that was the short version of the story.
I think it's fantastic because your company does a great job when it is servicing the natural gas traders. You've got natural gas operators. You've got natural gas midstream folks, and they all need data, and they need to be able to manage it and say, hey, what's going to go on? Tell us a little bit about your system. How does it impact all of these things and all these people? Because this is pretty cool stuff.
Well, thank you. It is very cool stuff. And, our purpose really is to provide really good tools so that these companies and the individuals, the analysts within these companies can do great analysis in order for the decision makers and those who decide on investments and how to invest their money and so forth, and policymakers who decide how to do analysis in support of policies and so forth, so that they make good decisions. So they make good decisions and good policy. That's our goal. Obviously, as a company, we want to expand and be profitable and all of those things. But from a technical purpose and a mission point of view, that's what our mission is to help these companies to make good decisions as far as energy is concerned. Now, the energy companies have huge amounts of data, Stu. Data is not really a problem in terms of quantity. Quality is another issue. And then, working your way through immense amounts of data in order to actually get intelligence from them, and to be able to use it correctly is another thing entirely.
Right.
So, we spend an awful lot of time getting the best data that's available and organizing it in such a way that you can actually use it to do credible forecasting of things like what's the supply going to be in the future of natural gas, what's demand going to be, how is that going to affect prices, what would be the effect of additional LNG exports out of North America, all of those kinds of things, which, our companies in North America are very, very interested in.
That's Dr. Brooks, that is a horrible amount of information that you've got to put into the algorithm. I mean, there's so many what ifs in what you just said. Holy smokes.
Well, that's true. And so what that also means is when you're looking out into the future, of course,
right,
there's a lot of uncertainty, even on the weather, as we know. This is one of the big drivers of demand all around the world is weather, in the near term, over the next several days or the next couple of months through the next winter and so forth. These are unknowns. So one of the things that you try to do as an analyst is to kind of hedge your bets by doing scenarios that look at, well, if it's a severely cold winter, what would happen? If it's a mild winter, what would happen? And so with these tools, you can do that kind of analysis. In other words, you can do multiple forecasts and then compare the results in order to get a reasonable range, for what is likely to happen.
Is the RBAC tool used for long-term contracts? So because we've seen in the natural gas with the geopolitical things going on right now, China has just entered into with Qatar I believe it was a 23-year contract. And then you have all these other contracts because Europe did not have any long-term contracts. So are the contract makers also able to use your software?
Well, it's very important for that, because you would like to know, if you're a buyer, is it, how long, if we're going to make a contract, if we're going to, work out a contract with Qatar or with the United States or Mozambique or somebody, how long should we make that contract for, and how much should it be, and where's the best place, or is it a good idea to maybe reduce your risk by having multiple contracts with different parties and even different countries?
Right.
So yes, that is definitely part of what we do with what we call our global gas and LNG modeling system.
Nice.
Definitely is very important. In fact, I'm actually going to China next month and talking at a conference in China that very subject, which is, looking at supply risk and, how to minimize your supply risk,
right,
through different kinds of LNG contracting and so forth. So, that's very, very important, I think.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I'd love to visit with you either while you're there or when you get back, because that is really cool.
I would be happy to do that. This will be the second time that I've been to China. I was there in 2018.
Right.
And it was, honestly, it was very, very interesting. My first time in China, I went to two different cities, one called Chengdu, which is in the Sichuan province in kind of the southwest part of China. And then the second place was in Beijing. And conferences and meeting with officials and all. And it was very interesting. They were very, very hungry for information, especially for information, actually, strangely enough, for information about liberalized gas markets. In other words, they were quite interested in how did the United States liberalize its market or deregulate, you might say.
Right.
And how could they benefit from doing things like that? I found them to be very nice people and very interested. I didn't get any kind of, there was nothing negative about that trip. I'm a little bit concerned about this time, just in the fact that over the last several years, the countries have gotten a little more antagonistic to each other.
Right.
But my guess is that I will be received very well, and that the people again will be very friendly and interested. So we're in a technical field that's not really directly political, and generally, people like that, I think, they see the value in discussing these things with other people who are in their field, no matter what country they come from.
Well, what are you seeing come around the corner from this? You mentioned, I mean, we talked about China, you're going over there with the geopolitical mess going on in Europe. When you sit back and take a look, part of Europe had a real problem because they didn't have those long-term contracts. And so Germany didn't have those long-term. They were doing what, market pricing. And then, Putin got all kind of hairy, and he started doing his things. And now Norway helps pick up that issue. And then you have the US getting a lot of benefit out of that. What do you see going on for natural gas prices? I think that there is 300 billion, something like that, in ships, in LNG carriers that's already been bought for all these years going out. There's a lot of people believing in LNG exports from the US. Where do you kind of feel where that market is going? There's about 16 questions in there.
There were, and I didn't enumerate them exactly, but let me try to address a couple of them. First of all, actually, Europe did have long-term contracts, but it was not long-term contracts for LNG. It was pipeline gas, long-term contracts with Russia. Now, some of these contracts were getting close to expire. Okay, so those things were happening, and the main thing, of course, was the volume of gas that was moving across Ukraine. And so, that was, of course, one of the main points of contention, between Ukraine and Russia, was performance of that gas transit across Ukraine over a number of different years. Anyway, it's a complicated subject. I don't want to get too much into it.
Okay. Yeah.
But the point is that, once the war started and the gas flows were, cut off, basically, in some cases, and Europeans also refusing gas as well, you had a situation, and of course, prices went way the heck up. I mean, it was just, incredible in 2022, especially initially after, the few months into the war. And there was quite a bit of LNG import capacity that was available, but it was not used very much. And so you are correct about LNG contracts, that because they were essentially as a continent divesting natural gas over a period of time, they did not have long-term LNG contracts for the most part. And this put them in a bind because in order to actually get the gas that they needed, they had to bid enough of a price on the spot market. And of course, the spot market went crazy. So you did have that situation. They had 21 LNG receiving points in Europe. You might not know how many they did have. But after this, all of a sudden, they have 26 more that are either in service now or are going to be built and so forth. So they're more than doubling, their import capacity. And that is really important. At the same time that, United States export capacity is increasing. And Qatar's export capacity will be increasing in a few years. And then there's other places, East Africa and so forth, where the supply of LNG could be going up quite substantially over the next 10 years or so. And, the long-term view that we have is actually kind of interesting, what we've had for a couple of years now, or more than a year, which is if Europe and Russia are not able to come to terms, in a few years, it's not going to matter. In other words, Russia is essentially going to work itself, completely out of the game as far as Europe is concerned. And the problem with that for Russia is that, they don't have too many options. It's not like they can all of a sudden take all that gas that was going to go to Europe and send it to Asia. They don't have any way of doing that.
Right.
So, so essentially Russia's kind of shot itself in the foot, as far as this market is concerned.
Right.
Of course, that's almost I almost even shouldn't say that, because it's obviously a very serious war, that's going on. But, from an economic point of view, I think is a very, very poor decision on their part.
Oh, absolutely.
And it is affecting them very badly and will affect them even worse in the future, I believe.
Let me ask you this one. China and Russia have agreed to several new pipelines, and they've contracted those out so that Russia and they've really aligned that. And China has really they've been buying everything they can. The Arctic LNG plant just had their second train come online for Russia. And so Russia's really still building up their export capabilities. So if in the oil space, the dark fleet has arisen, and Russia is now selling all their stuff, everything they can do in the oil space, to India and China, and it was below what they did. So we have their LNG exports are starting to come up, and do you see that whole paradigm that you just mentioned, that they may have shot themselves in the foot? And I agree with you 300%, but they still look like they're going to survive. I mean, does that make sense?
Again, okay, this time you have 17 questions instead of 16.
I am so sorry.
But actually, let me just straighten out a couple of things and then try to address a few of those, if you don't mind. The first thing is, actually, there's only one new pipeline project that has been proposed, not built, but proposed, connecting Russia to China. That's called Power of Siberia 2. There is a Power of Siberia pipeline that is in service. However, it's taking forever to fill up that pipeline. It's already been in service like 5 years, and it's only, less than 50%, full. So it's going to be, now they're looking at maybe 2027 before that pipeline is full.
Right.
China's in a very interesting negotiating position with Russia, because China actually has other options, you see, but Russia doesn't. So Turkmenistan is a huge supplier of natural gas, and potentially even much more, potentially, but they've kind of shot themselves in the foot also to some extent. But they have a new pipeline that's being built to China called the Central Asia China Pipeline D, because they already have A, B, and C.
Right.
So essentially, China can play off the Turkmens against the Russians as far as pricing is concerned. They also have their own production, which is very substantial, China, and they've got all this LNG import capacity. So they have quite a few different options, and they can play this game. But, as far as the oil is concerned, I don't really know too much about that, to be honest with you. My expertise is more in the natural gas arena.
Right.
But you did bring up an interesting point about Russian LNG. So, the issue you have here is, first of all, there's one LNG facility which is just north of Japan, called Sakhalin, and that one is really close to the market, right? It's very close to Japan, Korea, and China. Okay, so that one, there's a market for it. It's very straightforward. There's short distance, all of these things, and that plant has been operating at more than 100% capacity for many years, actually. Okay, which you can do in LNG, by the way. The capacity is not really fully the limiting factor. You can push it up a bit.
Sorry, I get excited on this. What's the limiting factor?
Well, there are limiting factors, of course,
Okay.
but I guess what I'm saying is the published nameplate capacity is usually
Right.
pretty conservative.
Conservative. Okay, great.
Okay, and so they can tune things up and they can do better than that, generally speaking.
Okay.
The problem with Arctic LNG 2 and the Yamal LNG facility is
Right.
that they're up in the Arctic, okay, and it is frozen all the way across the top of Russia to the east
Right.
of where they want to go, which is the shortest distance to Asia, but it's frozen 8 months out of the year.
Right.
And the other 4 months, it still requires the ability of an ice-breaking tanker to get through. So you can only operate it a third of the year.
Right.
The rest of the time you have to go west, which means you essentially have to go completely around the world to get to Asia.
Wow.
I mean, it is. So what they end up doing, a lot of it, they do that. But the other thing is the Chinese especially were very smart during Europe's crisis. And they took some of the cargoes that they owned, and instead of sending them, all the way to China to the west, they just sent them to Europe.
And then made the extra money.
At astronomical rates, so they made a huge amount of profit when they didn't really need that LNG, during that time period.
Now, Russia has, I think, 4 or 5 nuclear icebreakers. I mean, but you can't. It only operates, what you said, 3 months out of the year.
Well, they do need those, and they're actually, for Arctic LNG 2, they're building 15 more of those. Okay, so they're building 15 more of what they call the Arc 7s. Okay, which have some degree of ice breaking capability. Now, when the ice is really thick, you're right. They need to actually have another ice breaking, nuclear ice breaking.
Right.
Not a tanker, but a carrier, whatever you want to call it, of a ship, to kind of break the ice so that the tankers can move through it. So they have that. It's very costly. So they are doing one thing that is actually pretty smart, and they're building a transshipment terminal on both the north side and on the west side and the east side of Russia, in Murmansk and Kamchatka, so that they don't have to go so far. Because from those 2 facilities, they can use regular tankers to take the LNG to the remains of the market, the rest of the way to the market. So it's a smart way of dealing with things, but they still have the ice to contend with, and it's very expensive. So the Russian government has given all kinds of incentives to Novatek to do this, tax incentives and other kinds of things, so that their costs are quite a bit lower, that enable this to actually happen. But if you don't mind, I'll just say one more thing, and that is there's always the threat that Europe is going to say, we're not going to take any more Russian LNG, because even though they've cut the pipeline that takes out of the pipeline, and very minimal amounts of Russian gas is coming into Europe by pipeline, actually the amount of LNG that's coming into Europe is more than what it was before. So there are, some threats that certain European countries have made to make it illegal for European countries to receive that LNG if it's Russian. So if that were to happen, then Novatek would have some big trouble, and Europe would have to get LNG elsewhere. So I think that there is the market to do it, though.
What point do people start getting grumpy, Dr. Brooks, when they can't heat their house? And like in Germany, they shut down their last nuclear reactors, and they had to buy. They're now buying nuclear energy from France. People are starting to get a little grumpy. Don't you think that they would start having some kind of influence on that? I mean,
yeah, their costs are going way up. Germany's, the electricity costs are huge, and the other thing that's perhaps even more important there is that their industry, the cost to their industry, has gone to the point where, people are talking about the deindustrialization of Germany.
Exactly.
The world depends on German expertise in machine making and other kinds of things. I mean, it's a
Right.
very, very important country. This is good for some other countries, and as far
Yeah.
as competition is concerned, but very bad for Germany and very bad for Europe. So whether there's enough of a pushback, Stu, from the people and the industry and the companies, I don't know. I don't know if there's enough pushback. The Greens are very, very strong in Europe.
But I think this week also had, was it BASF? They closed a plant for fertilizer because not enough natural gas in Germany. And I think that was this past week. So, fertilizer affects the food. Natural gas,
Yes.
affects everything else. So we have a second order and a third order magnitude of problems that natural gas can fix or cause.
Yeah, if you oppose natural gas and just want to shut it down, it's a very unthinking or uneducated view of things, because there's not a recognition of everything that natural gas is used for around this planet. So if you get some activist who is trying to communicate, to some other activist on their cell phone, you point out to them that cell phone is largely made, from natural gas and all the metals and so forth. So there's a lot that they don't really understand about how modern civilizations, modern economies are based on these things. And anyway, I think it is important for people like yourself and myself and others to try to sort of gently educate these people, into, the truth about these things. And there's, go ahead.
I get excited, sir, talking to you, so I apologize. Why, when you looked at solar, why didn't you stay with solar or move to natural gas? Do you think you're going to go back to solar?
I think, of course, once I was in graduate school and I got very interested in learning more about the energy industry, and the focus has been on natural gas. And I really learned how to do the various components of analysis and mathematical modeling associated with the natural gas market and so forth. So my emphasis has been on that particular area. Now, I have actually done things that are outside of natural gas directly, but associated, like the relationship between natural gas and power, electric power, and the relationship between natural gas and natural gas liquids, which are very important for chemicals and plastics and other kinds of things. So I have done those kinds of things. I was very interested in solar energy, and even, in fact, as a graduate student, I also was actually employed by this Arthur D. Little company, and was very interested because they had some processes for making silicon wafers, that were used in making solar cells and so forth. And I thought that was, very, very interesting. And I even came up with, my own wild ideas on how to make things, more, to make solar more practical, more efficient and so forth. But I wasn't really an engineer or a scientist along those lines, so it didn't really carry those things through. But I think, over the years, I've gotten less optimistic, you might say, about solar energy and these renewables. And I tend to think a little bit differently, I think, than what a lot of the discussions that you hear when you hear things like natural gas as a transition fuel and so forth. Honestly, I think solar and wind are the transitions. Okay, these are the transition generation techniques, because they're not going to last that long. Eventually, at some point, first of all, it's a total lie that they're cheap. They are very, very expensive, and the amount of cost and degradation of the environment to make the materials and to mine the stuff and all of that kind of thing is ignored, by
Right.
those who are, the radicals that, that just want to replace fossil fuels immediately.
Right.
But I think in the long run, what long means, I don't know, but in the long run, researchers are going to find ways of controllable fusion power. And, we've already started to see some positive experiments. And I think in, who knows, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it might be that we will have that. And then truly we have something that doesn't produce radioactive byproducts and is essentially infinite in terms of its capacity. And I think, at that point, the world won't need natural gas for power generation, at least, but it won't need wind, or it won't need solar either. So these things will happen eventually. Right now they have their niches, solar and wind have their niches, and they will continue to do so. But I think that natural gas is going to have its niche for a very long time in the future as well.
Well, I love the way you think, Dr. Brooks. And I mean, I've been trying to find the sweet spot, because I hear that people are saying, oh, a wind turbine can last 30 years. I'm only finding with my crayon math, I went to Oklahoma State University, so, I got a crayon, and I can only find 8 years. And then the economics of that does not make sense. And then you sit there with a rough ballpark, depending on how much steel and everything else, carbon net zero is around 10. So this thing does not even meet its zero carbon footprint in all the ones. I've been begging for help, and I'm only getting part of the numbers. So you are dead on right with everything that you just said. So that's pretty good analysis on that.
Well, thanks. And yeah, I mean, I think many of us, we're not necessarily, rabidly pro fossil fuel or whatever. We just would like to see honesty and credibility in the analyses rather than narratives. So I think that's, people who are really scientific minded are fair. And, I mean, if it could be shown that actually there was a whole supply chain for solar and wind, that when you really truly calculated everything and you took into account the externalities of the mining, and you took into account the length of the supply chain and how long it takes for the mines to get certified and approved and developed. And I mean, you do the complete analysis and then just look at the results and make a choice. I think we would all be, most people would be willing to do that. I don't have any stock in oil companies or gas companies or solar companies or wind companies for that matter. But I would just like to see, good analysis and people able to use facts to make good decisions. I think that's where I am.
Well, Dr. Brooks, thank you so much for your time. If a CEO of Cheniere or a CEO of any company would call you up, what would you tell them about what you're working on?
Well, first of all, I'd say congratulations to Cheniere, that's for sure. I mean, they took a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy and made it into the world beater, so, congratulations to all the people that made that happen. And Venture Global came out of nowhere, to be a very, actually to be on the verge of a very successful company. And certainly, I think that, a lot of these companies, have really done some incredible things. Well, I would say, to them, look, if you are interested in how the markets could affect your company going forward, under different scenarios, and you don't feel like you've got the tools in-house already, to answer those problems, we do. We have those tools. And, we have the methodology, we've got the data, we can provide you with the structure that you can put your own market intelligence in there and come up with, your own solutions on, what the best strategy would be for either expansion or for contracts or for, whatever else that you want to do. So, of course, self-serving, we would be happy, to have them all as customers.
Well, that was very good. If somebody was wanting to reach out to you on your LinkedIn, you're on LinkedIn, and your website is RBAC.com.
Yeah, very simple.
So just reach out to you either that way, or I'd also like to put all your show notes in there, all your contact information. And I really want to have you back because I am so excited to hear about your China trip. I think that'll be phenomenal.
I think it will be too. So thanks for having me. And yeah, I would be happy to do it again. And we'll talk about some other things and what happened in China.
Sounds great. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you.